My name is Ania. I've got an interesting surname. So I'm originally from Poland. I am a Dundee, so Scotland graduate. I've done my MFDS, then I did the England Academy course with Arabic, diploma with the RCS England, got my little award, best England, just in Scotland. When do you sinuses? I mean, a lot of people don't feel very comfortable doing lateral window sinus lift, but I would argue that if you're doing internal sinus lifts, and unless you're doing internal sinus lift when you've got 6 millimeters of bone and then you're trying to raise 2, and you're never going to lose an implant in that. But if you're pushing the envelope, if you're working at 4 millimeters or below, you need to be able to do a lateral window sinus lift, because the chances are things can disappear, and you need to be able to cover that. So we've got internal lifts, and there's so many various different ways that you can do that. You've got drills, you've got the osteotomes, you've got the megagen drills themselves in certain way. You do lift things up for you as well. You can use strap lines, there's denser there. In an essence, you put something in that lifts the sinus membrane up from the inside of the mouth, from the ridge. Lateral window, again, we need to be able to raise things from the lateral side, make a little window, and lift things up. And there is a huge amount of variations, and we'll go through the research behind it and the lack of research behind why we do, what we put in there, do we put anything in there, how does it actually work? And then, do you put the implant in at the same time? Or do you close it, leave something in, close it, what happens when you do that? And then obviously the alternative to that is your pterygoid zygomatics. There is no one way of doing this. There's a lot of different ways, and you should be looking at a lot of different ways to work out what's the best way. And you have to consult the patient for the risks that are involved. If there's a good reason, there's a cyst, if there's a tumor, or if things start going wrong, if you block up the entire sinus, because if you're doing a big lift or something like that, this is going up. A sinus is a space. If you block up the entire space, you have no drainage, you've got infections, you've got problems. So, just to stay on the safe side, you see something big, ferret. Most of the time, you will see some thickening of the lining. There's certain things that are going to hugely affect how well your sinus healing is going to go. And that is a lot to do with the patient health, with any drug abuse. So snorting cocaine will make the lining a lot more frail. There might be some pathology in there. Smoking is a huge one, and you will find that if someone is a smoker, the lining will tear. They will not heal very well, and the chances that if you put a graft in it, that anything good is going to happen to that graft, they go down a lot. What you want to be doing is you want to either drill down to getting only about 1 to 2 millimeters of bone. Okay? If you go through it, you can tear the membrane, depending on what you're using. If you leave too much space in there and you're a little bit overly cautious, you will not get through this. If an internal sinus that goes particularly well, what you will end up with is an implant in there, and when you take an x-ray, there's going to be a nice bit of bone around that implant. Okay, that means that the bone is tenting above the implant, it's actually protecting the membrane around it as well, and that's an internal sinus that is. So yes, osteotomes, implant goes in. Now, there's some big questions that we don't actually have good answers to. How much can you tend that membrane? How much bone should you have in order to attempt an internal sinus lift? Well, again, when you look at the research, they've only really done the research which talks about 4-6 millimeters of bone. The procedure looks so much different if you've got 2-3 millimeters of bone. There is difficulties that go with that, but this is how you're avoiding doing a lateral window sinus lift. This is how you put the envelope. If you underprep, if you leave about 3 to 4 millimeters of bone internal. Let's say you're doing on a 6 millimeter and the bone is really quite hard. What you will find is the osteotome goes in and you start tapping it, you'll feel like concrete. It doesn't feel nice, and you will know right away. You just need to drill a little bit more and take it another 1 or 2 millimeters in, okay? Be very exact with your measurements. Check your CBCT. It usually underestimates the bone, so there's probably a little bit more in there, especially crystally. And this is probably when you could get problems such as tinnitus, vertigo, because the amount of pressure that you're putting through the entire skull could potentially fracture or disturb the internal ear. If you overprep it, you will perforate it, most likely. Although, sometimes you literally punch through, and if you're using a mechanism system, usually you don't actually tear the membrane. You'll come out and you have a little look and see the membrane going up and down very comfortably, because the pressure of the water itself just does that, yes. Be aware, if you're using osteotomes, do not, for a second, take your eyes off of it. Either you support it at all times, or your nurse literally puts her hand on it, make sure the patient doesn't close at any point, because they are used to having little breaks, but this is not break time. So yes, the problems with internal sinus lift, like I said, you can have tinnitus, vertigo. I've never had a case of that. I don't know whether it's more historical or it's just really quite rare, but it is theoretical, so should we be concerned for that? Possibly. And if you get it wrong, the patient will say, you are hammering my head, or you are hammering my head. It's really awful. They tend to not like this part. So here's the reason why I think that anyone attempting 4 millimeters or less internal lift should be prepared to do a lateral sinus lift. Is this. If you lose it, you have to retrieve it. Because if you don't, someone else is going to take it. You find a patient to maxillofacial. If you don't, you're working privately or working NHS, there's sometimes a little bit of a conflict there. And you will have a rather unhappy patient. Most people who come in for an internal sinus lift, you've told them this is going to be alright. A couple of taps. And if they end up in hospital for 2 days because they need a GA and their face is open and all sorts of complications, and they come out and they still don't have a tooth in there, you're not going to be particularly happy. So try to make sure, have a plan B, have a little, lateral sinus kit just in the corner of the room, make sure it's there every single time. And most likely, this will not happen unless you're really pushing the envelope. But if it does, you have to. While taking DPT and CBCT, it keeps moving. So it's there.
And there's a
5
record.
minutes, and 10 minutes later it's not there. Yeah, true. What's that?
And there's a record on it.
So, you need eyes on it. You need eyes on it.
So if it's gone through the membrane, then when you're doing the lateral window, you're just pulling that membrane apart to find it, aren't you?
Well, there's already a big hole in it. Yeah. So it does, if you go fit in a healthy person, it's a very thin mucous membrane. If you think about your cheek and a pizza bone or something like that, it's like a cheek lining, isn't it? It grows back really fast. It's epithelium. It covers everything you can. Yes, the normal things that are going to happen after a lateral window sinus lift. Sorry, internal. If the membrane tears, you might get bleeding from the nose, so tell your patients about that. Even if you didn't tear it at the time, they stay still, it's quite a disconcerting thing for a patient if they start blowing the nose and that comes out. Some inflammation, and which is why it's just so important to pick your patients. If they have had so much trouble with the sinuses, they had surgery on the sinuses, or problems with the drainage, they're constantly on antibiotics for it. The biggest review of literature on sinus lifts from 2014. What do you put inside of the sinus? And especially if we are doing a 2-stage procedure. Do we put autogenous bone? Do we put substituted bone? So they were looking at 100% bone, 80 bio-os, 20 bone, and 100% bio-os. And then they looked at some synthetics as well. And I'll try to explain why do people use the different materials and the thinking behind it. Okay? So bone obviously is resolvable. So on one hand, you're thinking it's going to encourage the turnover of your own bone. It's going to be more biologically better for the body. Then we'll mix it with some bio-os, which is a scaffolding material. And then if you put just bio-os in there, if you drill into 100% bio-os, it'll be flat. Maybe one day it'll convert into something else. And it's a little bit more complex than that because what you get inside of the sinus largely depends on the shape of the sinus. So if you're doing a graft, if you've got a really wide defect, you and I know that if you've got like 4 or 5 millimeter defect and you just put bio-os in it, you go back in, it'll be forever. It'll never really turn into proper bone because bone cells migrate maximum maybe 3 millimeters into the graft, right? So in the middle, the chances are you'll probably never get proper bone. If you have a really narrow sinus, you have a cavity that then has one side, the other side, and the floor, and at the top it's got the membrane, right? So it's got vascularity from those 3 sides. If it's narrow, the chances that you're going to get a half decent graft are much higher. If it's a really flat sinus, the chances you're going to get a half decent graft by putting bio-os in, but it's easier to do it. Yes. Short implant with crested lift or long with a lateral lift. I think a lot of the full arch work kind of hinges on that. Do you go in, do bilateral sinus lifts, or do you just put a couple of short implants? And again, not the best answer there, but they've got some long-term studies on what they call short. And like I say, they call short anything like 8 or smaller, which is pretty standard, but there we go. You get more bigger complications with the short, but you tend to get less bone loss, but the bone loss that you get is a higher percentage of the implant. So to get 2 millimeters of bone loss around a 15 millimeter implant, what's that going to do? Get 2 millimeters of bone loss around a 6 millimeter implant, that's a third of the height. That could start impacting things. But there is some pretty solid, evidence these days to say short implants work. Yeah? So this is the question: do you actually need to put any bio-os in if you're doing? So this is lateral window sinus lift with immediate implants, and you're lifting the membrane up above this level. Do you need to be putting bio-os in there, or you just membrane it? And very interestingly, there's a difference. A sinus lift eats up bio-os like nothing you've ever seen. Okay? You have it 2 gram little vial, and you have a second one there, just in case you actually need it. You go for larger granules, and it still eats it up because it's, you're usually working with like tiny little volumes of it, of this stuff, 0.25 minus, on 2 different sides. This eats the biomaterials up. You don't want to, push it in too hard, but you do need something that's going to hold the membrane up. So they started doing all this research, and all the evidence says that if you put a membrane behind it and you create a blood clot in there, you get exactly the same results.